As I said before, I hope that everyone had a good Thanksgiving. Did anyone fly home or fly somewhere in this past week? Anyone do much traveling that way? Doesn't look like anyone. My family loves to fly. We didn't go anywhere. We were here all week. But we love to fly. Diane and I both. Jillian has kind of caught this. She loves to fly. Benjamin, he will eventually. But we love flying, and you may not know this, but every aspect of a plane is tested thoroughly to make sure it holds together and functions properly during flight. And every time a new model of airplane is produced, the government requires a whole host of tests to be performed. A few years ago, I remember being intrigued by a news article with pictures of a Boeing 787 wing stress test. And they strap a plane down to the ground, and then they take these strong cables to pull up on the wings to see how strong they are, if they're going to hold up. Their goal is to pull the tips of the wings up 25 feet to get roughly to 150% of the most extreme forces the plane is ever expected to encounter. And so the test is part of a certification process to show that the airplane can withstand the most adverse of conditions. And so we've got a picture if you want to see. So this is, I'll step off to the side. So this is kind of a view. This is halfway up as they're kind of yanking up on this wing of the 787. If you go to the next picture, you'll see, I don't know if you can see in white on either side, how far those wings are being yanked up. That's 25 feet up, 150% of the most extreme situations and circumstances and pressure that they should ever have to face in flight. And this particular plane passed. If you go to YouTube, you can find some pictures where either they don't pass, or you can find some pictures where they just keep going to see how far before it will break. And there's a great video of one at 154%, and then boom, it kind of shatters. And it's crazy to see what happens. But they do this. They want to know that it can handle anything that will come its way. Do you ever feel like that plane? Do you ever feel stretched like that? I mean, maybe not like with your arm span and your how well you can bend backwards, but do you ever feel like that, being tested, being stretched beyond what you feel like you can handle? It might be your finances that are being stretched, where you're feeling tested if you will continue to obey God and trust Him when it doesn't seem like the resources are there. Can you obey and trust Him to meet your needs? It might be that your time is being stretched. If you have kids, that's likely the case. If you've got a new job or something like that, there's times when life, your time, and it just seems like you don't have enough time available for all of the responsibilities that you're shouldering, for the things coming your way, and you feel like, God, am I going to make it through this? Can I do this? Can I trust that I can put you first in my life and give you time, and still everything else will somehow get done? That's a test of obedience when your time is feeling stretched. It might be that you're feeling stretched in a particular relationship, being tested to see if you will continue to love a person that isn't loving you back, or that isn't forgiving you, or that isn't, whatever the break might be in that relationship. Sometimes we're tested. Are we going to keep loving? Are we going to persevere in treating them as we ought, regardless of how they're treating us? It might be that you're being stretched in your health. And it's one thing after another, and it's a test. Will you continue to be obedient? Will you continue to use your life and all that you have and all that you are to serve God, even when you don't know if the legs are going to keep working, the arms are going to keep working, the brain is going to keep working, whatever it might be? We can be tested in so many different ways. If you're feeling stretched right now, you might be able to relate at least in some way, to what Abraham was experiencing in Genesis 22. In our passage this morning, Abraham faces the most extreme of tests. The most extreme thing he would ever face in his life, kind of the ultimate test for him. And really, I have a hard time imagining a test any more difficult that any of us could possibly endure or walk through. He was stretched to the very limit of his faith. He was tested and he passed. It's a remarkable passage that teaches us much about faith and obedience and ultimately about God. And in the end, Abraham declares a new name for God. Now, this is one of the places where God doesn't reveal the name himself, but someone experiencing God through some circumstance, through some situation, experiences some aspect or attribute or characteristic of God, and they declare a name for him based on that experience. And we see in Genesis 22, verse 14, after Abraham kind of comes out on the other side, it says he called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." In Hebrew there, it says Abraham called that place Jehovah-Jireh, or Yahweh-Jireh, depending on how you pronounce it. If you were here last week when I preached on Yahweh or Jehovah, you'll remember that those are two different ways of pronouncing the same Hebrew word, the same Hebrew name for God. And I think Yahweh is the more accurate pronunciation. Jehovah is kind of, the King James kind of went that direction, and there's a familiarity that comes from that usage. As we move forward, my preference would be to just use Yahweh all the way through because I think that's more accurate, and yet sometimes we have to deal with familiarity and popular usage and what people would recognize, and so just to be less confusing, at least for people who maybe are familiar with some of God's names, or particularly the compound names that we'll start in on this week. There's compound names, and there's some familiarity out there using Jehovah, and so I'm just going to, for the sake of that continuity and to minimize confusion, I'm going to just use Jehovah for here on out for some of these compound names like Jehovah-Jireh or Jehovah Shalom or Jehovah Nissi. We could easily say Yahweh-Jireh or Yahweh Shalom or Yahweh Nissi, but just to continue with what might be more familiar to some people. But in Hebrew, that phrase is Jehovah-Jireh. The Lord will provide. And the Jireh part of that can be translated in one of two ways. It can be translated either to provide or to see, which is interesting. In fact, more often than not, in other contexts, it's translated to see. And maybe one of the best English ways to understand why that might be the case. In English, we have this phrase, "I will see to it." And what we mean is, I will take care of it. I will provide that need. I'll make sure it gets done. But that I will see to it kind of gets at that language of seeing being used to describe provision or meeting a need. And for God, in Scripture, his sight is intimately connected to his provision. Because he sees all things ahead of time, he's ready to meet those needs. It's his foreknowledge and his foresight that kind of goes hand in hand with his readiness to provide what we need when that situation comes up. We see this as well. There's an interesting parallel with English, the words provide and provision. Provide is the verb form, provision is the noun. But think about that, the word provision comes from Latin, provision. To see, vision, beforehand is the pro. So provision is simply to see beforehand, because when you see that, you're ready for that when it comes. And so because God sees all our needs before they arise, he's ready to meet them. He is our provider. And here Abraham is tested to see if he will really act in faith that God will provide. And it's an incredible test, one that many of us might be familiar with. It begins in verse 1 of chapter 22 of Genesis. It says, sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. I can't imagine what Abraham must have been feeling or experiencing to hear something like that from God. The story is told in a very minimalistic way. We don't get all of the details and the insights to Abraham's emotions. The story is very plain. It's kind of describing the events, and it doesn't give us that window that we would like. There's little glimpses that we can maybe tentatively read into, like the fact that he saddled up the donkey before he cut the wood, and makes you wonder, because in Hebrew it's showing a sequential activity, and maybe he's just kind of in a daze and he's just trying to take care of things, and all right, saddle up the donkey, oh yeah, I got to cut the wood. That's the best we can get is some of these like glimpses of what's going on, but you can imagine this is a heart-wrenching thing to be commanded to be told, to sacrifice your son on an altar before the Lord. This is not just like, for parents who've had to send your children off to college. I can imagine that being a difficult thing, or to wave them goodbye as they go to the other side of the world for some, mission trip or season of life. But this puts those things to shame. This is sacrificing your son. And it isn't just any son. You see the language used there in verse 2. Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. We get this fourfold description. Your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. This is the son of promise. This is the son that they've been waiting their whole lives for. This is the son that they never thought would come, that they doubted again and again, that God kept reminding them, no, I'm going to show up. This is the son that finally came. This is the miracle son who defied nature and science to be born to a 90-year-old woman. This is the son whose very name means laughter, because Sarah laughed when she was told by the angel that a year from then she would bear a son. God wants Abraham to sacrifice this beloved son. And as we work through the story, I want us to just notice or appreciate several things that ought to sink in for us. And the first is that we want to admire the mature faith of Abraham. Like we can't read this account without kind of standing back in admiration. Like if you've been to a museum or seen an incredible painting and it just makes you want to step back and just go, wow. Or if you're at the edge of the Grand Canyon and you just need a moment to let it sink in. When you see something amazing, something admirable, something beautiful, it's right to just notice it and appreciate it. And I think it's important for us to admire the mature faith that God has built into Abraham. That in admiring Abraham's faith, ultimately we're admiring the maker of that faith. When you look at a painting, yes, you're admiring the painting, but at the same time, you're admiring the artist. And faith is God's work from beginning to end. He creates it at the moment of salvation. He strengthens it through the trials and experiences of life. He sustains our faith throughout our life, and ultimately He will perfect our faith when we enter His presence for eternity in heaven. God is the author and perfecter of our faith, the Bible tells us. And so it's right for us to honor God by admiring His handiwork, by saying, God, the faith that you produced here is remarkable. Good work. Well done. We're praising God when we recognize the faith of Abraham. And I see at least three things that kind of make Abraham's faith stand out. Number one, the immediacy of his response. The immediacy of his response. Verse 3, early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. What the text doesn't tell us here, there's no delay, there's no waffling back and forth, there's no big argument with God that goes on for a while before Abraham finally relents and gives in. There's no, Jonah experience where he hightails it in the opposite direction and God needs a big fish to spit him out where he's supposed to go. Here's the mountain I told you about. There's no wrestling, there's no fighting, there's no fleeing. What we have is immediate obedience, which in light of the command is breathtaking and unbelievable. That the obedience is immediate. I've said from the pulpit before that one of the things we're trying to teach our children from an early age is that delayed obedience is disobedience. Delayed obedience is disobedience. And partial obedience is complete disobedience. Partial obedience, if Abraham saddles his donkey and cuts the wood and brings Isaac and goes 2/3 of the way there, 3/4 of the way there, and then turns back, that's not partial obedience, that's complete disobedience. And so God doesn't want delayed obedience in us. He wants us to respond. He wants us to say, "Yes, Lord." And here we see Abraham responding and obeying immediately, which is just absolutely remarkable. Now notice too, his faith expressed in his expectation of returning with his son. I'll look at verses 4 and 5. So on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up, so they're traveling for 3 days. Can't imagine, it's one thing if it was immediate, but 3 days of kind of rehearsing in your mind what this is going to be like. I can't imagine what 3 days of anticipation was like for Abraham. But on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship." And you hear this? "And then we will come back to you." So he's obeying. He's immediately responding to what God had told him to do. But he tells his servants, "We're going to go over there and we're going to worship. And then we are going to come back." There's an expectation of returning. And I wonder what Abraham is thinking. Well, in reality, we don't have to wonder. The book of Hebrews actually gives an interesting insight. In Hebrews 11, in this hall of faith, as the author of Hebrews kind of recounts these heroes of faith from the Old Testament, in Hebrews 11, verses 17 to 19, it says this. It says, "By faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, 'It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned.' Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. And figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead." That's an interesting insight. So without any prior, at this point in history, we're not told of any resurrection taking place. But because of what Abraham had experienced thus far in his life, because of seeing God's ability to bring life out of a dead womb, to bring life when no life should be there, Abraham reckons that God can bring life back from the dead. And so Abraham goes in obedience, knowing that God will be faithful to provide. Knowing that the God who promised that through this son will become a nation. Know that all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through your descendants. And ultimately he said that's going to be through Isaac. He was very clear about that in his previous promises. And so Abraham is saying, well, God promised that he's going to do this. So if he's asking me to go sacrifice him, then God is going to bring him back from the dead because God will not fail his promises. We see third, Abraham's faith in verses 6 to 8 in his response to Isaac. Verse 6, it says, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. You can hear the intimacy in their interaction. Father, yes, my son. And this question from Isaac, he's kind of confused what's going on here. And Abraham, by faith, God will provide the lamb. Every step of the way, Abraham is obeying, but he's obeying knowing that, I don't know how it's all going to work out, and I don't know exactly how the pieces are going to go together, but I know what God has said, I know what he's promised, and so I'm going to walk by faith and trust that he's going to work it out. That's an incredibly difficult thing to do, but that is the task of faith. That is the life of faith that we are called to. We don't have to figure it out. We don't know how God's going to work it out before we get there. We're simply called to obey, to put one foot in front of the other, one step at a time, and to trust that in his timing, in his way, he'll deal with it. He'll resolve whatever conflict is there. And so he's going, trusting that God is going to do something, that God will provide as needed. Now, normally when we read the story, it's Abraham that we are kind of most admiring his faith, but I think it's important for us to notice as well the faith of Isaac here. To notice the faith of Isaac. At this point in the story, if you've been with us, because we've been following Abraham for several weeks through this sermon series, you might remember that it was age 75 where God first shows up and tells him to leave his homeland. It's age 90 when they are kind of wondering if God's going to follow through, and they end up saying, well, what about my maidservant Hagar? And, so then, okay, maybe that's how God's going to provide, through this maidservant. And so they have a child through her, Ishmael, and no, God says that's not going to be it. And then they keep waiting, and ultimately it's 25 years later. So at this point, so it's 25 years later, so Abraham's 100 when Isaac is born. Now Isaac is, best guess, probably 10 to 15 years old. And so Abraham then is 110 or 115. And so Isaac is undoubtedly the stronger of the two. He's the one carrying the wood up the mountain. Abraham puts the wood on Isaac to carry. And so Isaac is the stronger. I'm willing to bet Isaac is the faster of the two. And so there's no way that Abraham could bind Isaac and lay him on the altar against his will. I don't know if you've thought about that. That Isaac is a willing participant in this. Isaac was submissive to his father in this. Now, we don't know how much Abraham shared to kind of catch Isaac up to this willingness or to kind of foster that willingness. We don't know if Abraham is recounting his testimony and saying, no, listen, Isaac, listen to what God has done. Listen to his faithfulness. I mean, there might have been a long conversation where Abraham is kind of rehearsing God's faithfulness to kind of build that courage in his son to go along with this. We don't know about that, but we can see that Isaac is submissive. Isaac is trusting. There's an incredible faith in Isaac here as well. And I think we can see here more clearly how all of this, how this whole account in Genesis 22 is prophetic, pointing forward to the experience of Christ. Abraham representing the father, being willing to give up his beloved son, and Isaac representing Christ, being willing to give his life. I think of this line from Isaiah 53, which was predicting Christ's willing participation in his death. Isaiah 53:7, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. That's what's said of Christ as he willingly goes to the cross. Jesus himself said, "You don't take my life, but I give it." That Jesus didn't try to run away. Jesus willingly went to the cross. And I think that's paralleled kind of every step of the way. The sacrifice of Jesus is paralleled in this account here. We see in both Abraham and Isaac a remarkable level of faith. And John Calvin remarks on this. He says, "This example is for our imitation. In such straits, the only remedy is to leave the event to God in order that He may open a way for us when there is none." And Calvin concludes, "We pay Him the highest honor when in affairs of perplexity we nevertheless entirely acquiesce to His providence." So we pay God the highest honor when, even though it doesn't make any sense, and even though I have no idea how He's going to show up, I have no idea how He's going to provide, I have no idea how He's going to get me through this, I'm still putting one foot in front of the other, and I will obey. And I'm going to leave everything up to Him. He will work it out, but I'm going to trust Him each step of the way. I want us to reflect as we admire this faith. Let's reflect on the foundation of that faith, God's promises and His past faithfulness. See, nobody gets that level of faith overnight. You don't just spontaneously have that kind of faith. That faith is nurtured, that faith is grown, that faith is matured, that faith is polished and shaped by the author and perfecter of our faith. He starts it and He perfects it. And He works it, and it's this process over time. And so how did Abraham get to this level of faith? The answer is that this is not the first time that Abraham had experienced God as Jehovah-Jireh. Even in verse 8, as we saw, when he says, God will provide, God Himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. That word provide is Jireh. God Himself will provide. It's because of His past provision. It's because Abraham has known God as Jehovah-Jireh for a long time, is the way that Abraham can trust God in a situation like this. He's not discovering that God will provide. He's been living in God's provision for years. God's tests are part of His preparation. And so there's a sense in which Abraham has been tested and tested and tested, and all of that has prepared him for this, and this test as well will deepen even more his faith in God, his trust in God, his obedience to God. Tests have a way of doing that. I want us to look briefly at Deuteronomy 8. I think we've got that on the screen. Because in Deuteronomy 8, there's this interesting kind of teaching on God's testing of us. And so we'll look just first at Deuteronomy 8. I should have it there, 1 through 5. Here God is saying, He says, "Be careful to follow every command I am giving you today, so that you may live and increase and may enter and possess the land that the Lord promised on oath to your forefathers. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the desert these 40 years, to humble you and to test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep His commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger and then feeding you with manna which neither you nor your fathers had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothes did not wear out, and your feet did not swell during these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you." I was struggling and wrestling a little bit with the account in Genesis 22 where God talks about testing in order to know what's in your heart or in order to know whether you will obey. And I've spent a good bit of time thinking about that. What does it mean for the God who knows all things to test you in order to know something? I think we can talk more about it. I think the best understanding is that the word know can refer to not just head knowledge, but experiencing something. That God just doesn't want to know that Abraham could pass the test, but God finds delight in experiencing Abraham passing the test. There's a knowing and experience that's different from a knowing in our head of what will happen. I think that's probably the most helpful understanding of that, but it's clear that God is doing more than just simply experiencing that. And we get this insight in Deuteronomy 8, if you want to put 1 through 5 up again, because notice how testing is described here. It's described as humbling. I humbled you and tested you. At the end, in verse 5, it's described as disciplining. And notice the purpose for the testing. To know or experience whether or not you'd obey. Number 2, to teach you. There's a teaching process here to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. So this testing is also a teaching. Similarly, I think implied in the word discipline is the intent of shaping and leading someone to maturity. The purpose of discipline is to mold and shape behavior and character. And so this testing has a purpose. And we see it again in verses 15 and 16. There we see God kind of coming back to this. It says, He led you through the vast and dreadful desert, that thirsty and waterless land with its venomous snakes and scorpions. He brought you water out of hard rock. He gave you manna to eat in the desert, something your fathers had never known, to humble and to test you, so that in the end it might go well with you. See, there's a purpose to God's testing. There are reasons, there are things that He's going to produce, and ultimately it's so that it's for your good, so that it will go well with you. I don't know about you, but as I think about tests that I had back in my academic career, I don't think that there was ever a test that if I had the option of not taking it and still being okay, like I would have chosen to not take it every time. Maybe you enjoyed tests, maybe you looked forward to that, but I didn't particularly like tests. But yet on the other side, the tests have a way of not only revealing your knowledge, but also increasing your knowledge. Tests can shape you and mold you in the process of taking them. As I look back, though I wish I could have avoided some, I'm grateful for them. And I'm glad that I haven't had a life of just running away from every challenge and test that's come my way. Tests reveal as well as mold and shape. On Thursday morning, I participated in a 5K, the North Reading Turkey Trot. And if you haven't run a 5K, 3.1 miles, if you've never run, 3.1 miles is a long run. But once you've started to get in shape, 3.1 miles isn't unbearable. It's doable. It's a relatively minor run. But I think of a year ago, because I ran it for the first kind of race I'd ever done like this was a year ago on Thanksgiving, and Harry and Audrey Beard kind of lure me in, like a sheep going to the slaughter. They bait me into this 5K, and I was not in great shape at the time. I survived it. I didn't die, but it wasn't pretty. And it was interesting to think of, this year compared to last year. I didn't win the thing by any means, but I ran 6 minutes faster than a year ago. And the difference is that, in a sense, I think running is like a test. You avoid it if you could. And, if I could get all of the benefits of running and feel, get the energy and be in shape without running, then man, give me that. I'll sit on the couch and have all of the benefits of running. But you only get those benefits by enduring that test. And every time you're running, it's like, should I stop now or should I keep going? And it's that like, I'm going to press on and I'm going to do it. And the test of running shapes you and it molds you and it strengthens you. And you get healthier and you get stronger. And that flexes muscles, it flexes your lungs, and you get healthier because of it. And I think of more extreme tests. Only an idiot would jump into a marathon without some practice, without working up to it. You don't just jump into that overnight. And there's a sense in which I think this experience in Genesis 22 was Abraham's marathon. It was kind of his ultimate test. But thankfully, he'd been obedient long before this. And he'd learned with all of these little warm-up tests, when God shows up and says, go to a land I'm going to show you. And he says, okay. That's not as bad as saying sacrifice your son. It's still a test. And Abraham responds, Abraham obeys, and Abraham learns that God can be trusted. And test after test in Abraham's life prepares him by deepening that conviction that if I obey, God is faithful. He'll meet my needs. He'll see me through. He'll give me whatever I need. God is faithful. And I think for you, as to kind of just boil this down, if we are going to know and experience God as Jehovah-Jireh, I think before we can fully experience God as our provider, we must first be willing to obey him fully. It starts with obedience. And maybe you've never experienced God as Jehovah-Jireh, as God is your provider, because you haven't been willing to walk in obedience when God commands you to do something. When God says, this is what I want you to do with your money, and we say, yeah, I don't know about that. If you balk at obedience there, then you're not going to see God as your provider financially. You're not going to say, man, I was obedient, and I didn't know how God was going to get us through the month, but he did, and he met our needs. The testimonies that we hear from other believers who've walked through this are only testimonies because they walked by faith and obedience. And if you're never able to say, yes, Lord, okay, then you'll never have that testimony of God as your Jehovah-Jireh. I think of the story of there was a house on fire, and a little girl was trapped in her upstairs bedroom. As she leaned out the window, her father, who was on the ground, said, "Jump, I'll catch you." The little girl was afraid. She says, but I can't see you. And to which the father shouted, "That's okay, I can see you." And she jumped to safety, not because she could see, but because she trusted the voice of her father who had told her to jump. And she was willing to let go. And the way that you grow in trust of the voice of your Father is by taking little steps of faith, by obeying him one step at a time, and by learning that he can be trusted. Learning that when I don't know how it's going to work out, I'm going to obey, I'm going to leave it to him, and he shows up. And he provides, and he meets your needs, and little by little, through these little tests, he builds and he strengthens your faith till you become an Abraham or an Isaac, ready to give your son, ready to give your very life, ready to give whatever it is that he asks of you. Romans 8:32 says, "He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also along with him graciously give us all things?" I want to challenge you today. Are you trusting him by obeying him? Because if you want to experience God as Jehovah-Jireh, God, the Lord, your provider, it starts with you obeying him and giving him that opportunity to show up and to provide in just the way that you need. Let's close in prayer together. Father God, we know that this is not easy. God, that you have a way of testing us where it hurts and asking us to let go of things that we so desperately cling to. God, for those here who might be in a relationship that is not of you and are struggling to let go, God, I pray that you would give them the strength to obey and trust you to meet their needs. For those here with financial struggles, not sure how to obey and wondering if you're going to provide, God, I pray for the courage to obey. God, that you might show up and be there, Jehovah-Jireh. God, whether it's relational struggles or health struggles, God, we just need you in so many ways. God, help us to not use the challenges of life to be excuses for spiritual apathy, for laziness, for disobedience, for procrastination. But God, help us to obey, and to obey without delay. God, that you might supply, that you might provide, that you might create a testimony in our lives at your sufficiency to meet our needs, even when it doesn't seem earthly possible. So help us, God, to walk in obedience today and this week. In your name we pray. Amen.